So, and this can actually be for under treatment as well. So I often think, even if you do a treatment that's really subtle and matches all the aesthetic goals, if that patient doesn't feel different and behave differently, that's also an unethical treatment. Welcome to the Aesthetics Mastery Show. I'm Dr. Tim Pearce.
Hi, I'm Miranda Pearce.
And today we've got probably one of the most important shows we're going to do, which is around how you justify your decisions in a medical aesthetics consultation. Now, this could sound a little bit dry and lectury, but I promise you it's the secret to great job satisfaction, loyal client base, and even getting rid of the patients that you don't actually want to treat in a way that they don't really mind. So we're going to go through that in some detail, and I'm sure it's going to make sense of a lot of this industry. When you look out there in social media and see how people are communicating, you're going to realize what's going on, and it's going to make everything a lot clearer.
So we're talking about justifying our interventions, basically. Why is that important?
Well, before I dive in, if you give us a like, really appreciate it. Helps the YouTube algorithm share our posts with you next time you log on and other people who are trying to learn. So really appreciate that. Thank you. So it's really important to realize that when you provide a treatment to a patient, you are essentially putting a case forward that it's in their best interest that you do this procedure. And when you get that wrong, both you and the patient realize it, but also it's what creates all the friction afterwards. And when I say justification, it could simply be that they have different expectations to you. So your justification for the treatment and their justification is different. But it goes much bigger than that in terms of how you do all your work and sometimes how you say no to your patients as well. So you've got to essentially build a hierarchy. I call them the gods of aesthetics. There are various justifications that we can use to do procedures, and there's a hierarchy of these different justifications. And what I'm hoping to get across to you guys today is that if you get all of these justifications in alignment, you will have a wonderful career with lots of patients who are grateful for your work, and you will also have minimal kind of conflict later on down the road because you are in alignment with some very important truths. And we're going to try and go through that. And what I'd also like you guys to do as we do go through them is to have a look around you at various people that you see communicating in our sector and figure out which God they're talking about each time they're on a particular topic, and then see how you can use that God but get it in alignment with the others so that you can make great decisions and have patients who appreciate your efforts and your work.
So give us some examples of these justifications.
So when I first started training, I remember as you pick up your initial skills, you start to think that knowing that particular skill is the way that you're going to essentially appease the gods. If you know that, that's something that will protect you from harm and will help you build a business. And for most injectors, and we know this from the algorithm, if we talk about injection technique, you guys absolutely love it. And that's right at the beginning, is that you focus on those technical skills. But those technical skills are absolutely not enough on their own for you to thrive. You can know every technique and every clever way of doing things and still get into an awful lot of hot water if you haven't got the other pieces in the right sequence. So this is complex to understand, but it will make a lot of sense to you, I think, as you start to think about more than the initial goals that come to a trainee injector's mind when you're first learning. So for me, it was injection technique first, and I thought I could justify my procedures by knowing the anatomy, knowing where to put the needle, and that was going to keep me safe, essentially. Beyond that, you start to realize that, well, actually, it's more the anatomical justification. So I remember learning about the fat pads and thinking, this is fantastic. I can explain to all my patients why they need their fat pads tweaking, and I will then be able to build a great business off the back of my knowledge of fat pads. Now, these things are kind of fleeting thoughts, and I'm caricaturing it to help you understand it, but essentially there does become a focus on that. You may then next learn about the aesthetic rules. So now I know my rules and my ratios and my proportions, and you start to try and justify all your treatments based on the aesthetic rules. And you think, well, as long as I'm making a good aesthetic difference, then I'm going to be able to build a great business off the back of my ability to create aesthetic differences. And that is not enough either. You'll see sometimes clinicians go down the route of evidence-based, and they'll talk a lot about what the evidence is, and they'll try and justify anything they do based on a paper or some evidence that comes out. And that's also really important. And we obviously need to try our best to be evidence-based despite the lack of evidence in our sector. But we should try our best, but it's not enough on its own either. So what we need to try and do is align everything around one common goal and get that sequence right and justify our actions by the biggest and the most important truth that we can find. And that's what I mean by the analogy of gods, which is, if you think about what religion does, whether you're religious or not, it's about aligning yourself with something that's ultimately the truest and the most important truth. And when I'm talking about false gods, I'm not talking about things that aren't true. I'm saying that they may be the smaller god that we're worshipping, and it's not the bigger god. And if we can get all those gods in a nice, neat line and get everything, all our actions in alignment with all of those truths, that's what's going to create a wonderful career for you and happy patients on the other end.
So what is the most important God?
So when I think about the health of our patients, so if you're a healthcare professional, and that's obviously who we're mainly talking to, we have to justify our actions by the effect on the patient's health. The problem that we have is that most of our patients are physically healthy when we meet them, and therefore, if you're taking a risk with their physicality, if you're sticking a needle into someone, that's a risk. How do you justify that intervention? And I believe the only possible way to do that is with the psychosocial experience of that patient. So how do they feel, and how do their feelings affect how they behave in a certain situation? And that, for me, is the highest God that we can praise. Essentially, is the patient. Who's the most important? Who is funding all of this work that we do? Who is, who is the person who is channeling money in so we can all build businesses? It's the patients. That they are the ones who we need to worship. And when I say worship, it doesn't mean they're the boss of you. Like they have to be the justification for all the work that you do. And
Patient-centered care.
yeah, absolutely. But it's very easy for a clinician to seek status by owning a particular idea or concept. And I'm not even saying that's necessarily wrong, because we need those voices out there who bring those certain truths to the table. But what my only point is, that's not the end of the story. You have to then align that with what patients are really after. Like, really spend some time understanding what patients, the difference patients are trying to feel in their lives, and how you can link that down to everything. So your individual injection technique is linked with how someone is actually going to feel on the school run, and how they're going to talk in the playground to the other mums because they feel differently. It's simple things like that, and it takes a more conversation and more understanding. But if you get it right, you will feel so much better about all the work you do, but also you can more delicately refuse treatment to people who you don't believe is going to actually make a difference in the way that you think is good for their lives. And they won't hate you for it when you say no, because you're doing it in their best interest. But that takes some discipline, because it's so easy to revert to my knowledge of aesthetic. The appearance is how I will reject you from treatment, or your knowledge of anatomy is why I will reject you from the treatment. Instead of saying it's when I picture doing this procedure, and I picture how you think it may affect your life, I don't see that playing out. So I can't take that risk with you because you're very precious to me. It's essentially that argument that you are looking after them, and that's why you say no, as opposed to I know more than you, and that's why I say no, which is very easy to slip into. And I'm sure I've done it in the earlier parts of my career, but it never felt right. And the missing piece is everything is justified by the patient's best interests. And actually that needs to run through everything we do with healthcare professionals. And even, a lot of the social media stuff that goes out, and there's been a lot of, I'm slightly going off track, but a lot of controversy about kind of bullying and how we engage with each other in our community, in the aesthetics community. Really, you need to try your best to justify even your social media output, and the things you say between colleagues all has to be in alignment with what's good for patients ultimately. And if it's not good for patients, then you shouldn't be doing it. And ultimately, that's not just because I'm saying what's right and wrong. I'm saying because there'll be a consequence. Like, you'll experience some sort of difficulty or pain the more out of alignment you are with the most important person in the room, which is the patient.
So much to unpack here, but I just want to get it in there. I've been in this industry 13 years, and I wake up in the morning and my God is you guys and looking after the clinicians to move their lives forward. And the clinicians that I see doing the best, as in they have a very, very successful aesthetics business, are those clinicians who worship their patients. and who don't wake up in the morning thinking, I wonder what my colleagues will think, or, oh, there's not enough evidence for that, or, oh God, obsessing about the anatomy. It's like, of course you have to do those things, but first comes your patient. And if you just, we'll talk a little bit about how we can do that. But I just wanted to reinforce, I am a studier of your success, and those people who are the most successful worship their God.
And it's not instinctive that you go into this industry and do that. In fact, I think what instinctively most clinicians do is they look to be validated by their colleagues, cool. which is reasonable in many ways, except that not all your colleagues are on your side, and they have their own agendas. And you can get a lot of good guidance from a colleague, but sometimes they will be thinking about themselves, not about the patients. In fact, quite a lot of the time.
Even if it's just subconscious, they're not trying to be bad to you, but they just have, like you say, they've got their own agenda.
Yeah. So the only agenda that you can't go wrong with meeting is what is a patient who's seeking to improve their lives. Yeah. You can decide whether you can achieve that goal or not, but that's where you should be focusing most of your attention. And sometimes that will be, won't make sense to people on the outside, but you've got to stay focused on that, because you understand your individual patient better than anyone with a rule or ratio. And that ultimately, that's probably the best way in the long arc of time to orientate yourself in the sector for your own success.
Yeah, definitely. We'll come on to, I need some sort of like practical things we can hang our hat on in terms of how we can do that. But before we do, give us a bit more of a detail about this psychosocial justification. What kind of things will a great consultation and then a great treatment do for patients?
So in order for you to understand this, you have to do a good consultation where you actually get to the bottom of what your patient's really looking for. And I know this from years of experience, that patients don't often know until you ask them. They will have, I'm sure we've all done things like this. Like, you go looking for a car, you want to buy a car, and you think, really, what you need from a car needs to go from A to B. But almost no one buys a car simply to get from A to B. You start to think, well, how you feel in that car, and how does it make you feel, and what will your neighbors think, and does it corner well, and all these things are not A to B. And they're actually meeting your psychological needs, essentially. And it's just the same with an aesthetic treatment. People will think, oh, I'd love to have my lips done. But what are they really looking for? There's a moment in their day where they are unconsciously or semi-consciously imagining feeling differently. And I think they unconsciously connect that if they feel differently in that situation, they're also going to be able to behave differently. And when they can behave differently, they're actually shifting the direction of their whole life. And that's ultimately what aesthetics about, is we change how people look, yes, but we should change how people look in order to change how they feel, in order to make them behave in a way that's more likely to help them survive in their environment. It's essentially that.
What kind of behaviors might they change?
So it's interesting when you start to ask patients this, the common stories that come out are, for one of the examples I've already thrown is the school run. It's incredibly important for mums to feel on the front foot on the school run. Now, I'm not a mum, obviously, and I've never thought this way about the school run. I just come in, drop the kids off, and off I go. And I don't actually and I'm normally in a rush if I'm dropping them off, and at the end of the day, it's the other way around. But I know that talking to patients, it's a really common part of the day that's a bit scary for people. So it's like, get yourself ready for that moment so that you can feel on the front foot. So that's a really simple one. I once had a patient who gave me permission to tell her story, who in her younger days had a cocaine addiction, and she developed a dip in her nose, and this dip on the school run was a huge problem because it represented shame to her. So what could have just been described as an aesthetic imperfection, because it wasn't a big dip, most people wouldn't have noticed it, for her became a symbol of shame that meant she couldn't take her kids to school. So I could easily have not got to that point in the consultation and just said, well, there's a dip, can I fix it or not? Can I justify this with the anatomy? Can I justify it with the aesthetic? Can I justify it by the fact that you want it? Because that's another justification people use, the patient wants it. And instead the justification becomes, if I can correct this issue, will you be able to take your kids to school? And that's a really objective outcome, because either she's done it or she hasn't. And if that's the deal, what you're really doing is freeing a person from their concern and helping them live a different life. And for me, that's the ultimate truth that we aim for, which is that patients feel and behave differently. And all the other things that we have to worship, the anatomy and the evidence base and all that stuff, has to be in alignment to maximize your chances of freeing that person in their conflict. But that's really how everything needs to be built, is around that patient's life and how they behave in that moment, and not all the other ways that we can achieve some attempt at getting close to truth, but it's not complete.
100 million%. And I think that lady, didn't she start going out for meals with her partner and all that kind of stuff as well?
Yeah, actually, that was the smaller goal that we set. And it's worth doing and I hope everyone will attempt to do this, is that when you can get to the bottom of how your patient's behavior, how they would long for their behavior to change, which you don't always get that easily. Sometimes it comes down in an unguarded moment when they're relaxed. They actually finally say what they're really there for. But if you can pin down what their big goal is, try and find a slightly smaller goal that still matters to them. I use this in my normal GP practice as well, which is you aim for the smallest meaningful bit of progress. Because if you make it the big piece of progress, it's quite likely that they'll fail. Like if you want to have a few treatments so you've got confidence to actually apply for a job and you haven't worked for 3 years, that might be too big a goal to achieve in one treatment. So what are the other things that go along with that behavior? I want to, it could be as small as talk to my neighbor or call a friend, or but you're shrinking it down so that they're getting some change in behavior, which then often leads on to the next. But so try and find a behavior that you can say is the real goal of the treatment. And this is why it really helps you get rid of patients who you can't help, because clinicians are terrified of the unsatisfied patient. And they're terrified because the goal keeps moving. That's because the patient is setting the goal, which is, I want you to treat me in a certain way until I'm satisfied. And if they've got basically body dysmorphia, it's a moving target, and you'll never achieve satisfaction. Well, what happens when you make that an objective outcome? If I treat you, you will feel different in this way, and I can show you a picture of your cheeks or whatever it is, or that line faded, and you're not able to behave differently in your life, I can't keep treating you. Because as a healthcare professional, I can't take a medical intervention, risk a medical complication, if I don't believe it's actually going to make you happier or healthier. So this is where these objective behavior changes are a really concrete way to justify your treatment. That actually also is a bit of leverage for the patient to actually change their behavior, because they've almost made the deal themselves that if I'm having this treatment, I'm also going to go internet dating like I said I would, and it's part of, and it has this therapeutic effect for them as well, that they actually go and do the things they want to do.
It's so beautiful, and it's so right on so many levels. People watching this here might be thinking though, okay, well, I've never really asked these kind of deep and meaningful questions, and I don't want to be prying, and I don't want to be weird. If you are faced with, let's say, a 27-year-old who's looking to have lips done, how can you begin that conversation?
Well, you're right. If you just say, tell me about something that, in a moment of your day that makes you feel really vulnerable, and you've just met them, they will naturally clam up, because what's the reason? All humans need a reason to exchange something of value and to be vulnerable. And the reason is you need to tell them what kind of practitioner you are. So what I say in my consultation is, the goal of this whole process, my consultation, is to find treatments that are actually going to improve your life and make you happier and healthy and do things. So in order for me to plan a treatment that is going to meet those goals, I need you to tell me a little bit about your day-to-day life and how your appearance is affecting how you feel, which then might affect how you behave in certain situations. And it's not always as obvious as the cases I've told you, but there's always a moment in the day when there's friction. There's a sense of that unwanted baggage. There's a sense of deterioration, or I wish things were better, or I'm going to avoid that photograph. And the more you get into this, the better you will find questions that actually pinpoint what the real conflict is, when it occurs. And then you can start to say, well, will my treatment actually create that difference? And it's very easy to say no in that case as well, if it's not going to create the difference. And it's also extremely rewarding when you do create the difference, and it's not just that their lip looks bigger, but you actually see them on Instagram taking pictures and out there living their life because of what you did.
Exactly. And also I think it unearths any problems around, they might come to you saying, oh, my friend had 3 areas, I want 3 areas. Well, if you were a vending machine and you just give them 3 areas, that literally might not be, it's not the real thing they want. They want to look fresher. So they might actually need their tear troughs doing or whatever. But if you don't dig, then you're going to get that wrong, aren't you? And then that's going to store up loads of other problems.
Yeah.
So we've spoken about the patient as being the God that we need to be in partnership with. But where's the line? Because sometimes that leads to overtreatment.
So, yeah, it's definitely worth trying to explore the overtreated patient and what psychological needs they are meeting. Because if you understand it from that point of view, so I'm never been a proponent of thinking that they're either mad or ill-informed. There's sometimes that, but there's also there's the interesting idea of trying to think, well, what is good about this treatment, even though we think it's bad because there's overtreatment. What is good about it from the patient's perspective? And I must acknowledge my friend Dr. Kev, who we had a great conversation about this, and I'm going to get him on live to talk about it more. But he's thought in detail about what it feels like to have lips that are full. And I don't want to ruin the whole thing because it's very interesting psychologically. But let me use a different example, which is, the can I speak to your manager haircut?
Yeah.
So this got me thinking, and there are a few analogies about this as well, which is certain treatments are done, I believe, to fortify the individual against the chaos of life. Like they are, and in fact, you'll often hear patients talk about, or women talk about in particular, makeup being their war paint. Now, I heard that years ago, and I never really thought much about it until one day I was thinking, well, there's many a true word said in jest. Like it's not simply a joke. That is why people put makeup on, is to go and confront risky situations. Like going out socializing when you're 19 and you're going to a club is actually a very risky thing to do. Rejection is awful, so your makeup is war paint. Your can I speak to the manager haircut is making you look formidable. Some of the words that are used to describe treatments, the snatched jawline, and even Maurizio De Maio talks about the dangerous look. So I believe that humans want to fortify themselves against risky situations by looking formidable. And that doesn't mean that it's aggressive. It just means kind of well put together and structured. And I think some of the overtreatment is an overreach of trying to reach that goal of looking basically on the offensive. So you can always think of your treatments, broadly speaking, is this patient on the defensive or on the offensive? Are they trying to restore themselves, or are they trying to beautify themselves? And what does beautifying mean? It doesn't always mean looking normal. It sometimes means taking it to the edge, to look formidable, to look cut and, extra fit, or however you describe it. It's not a drive to normality. It's a drive to the edge of it. And the overreach is the problem, because then instead of looking formidable, they just look overfilled. And
tell us why that's a problem from our clinical perspective.
Well, the issue is that you have to get into the mind of what the patient is after and decide whether that is a healthy goal or not. Now, I'm of the opinion that if you're 23 and you're going out, you should feel on the front foot. Like I think it's perfectly fine to look as gorgeous as you can, to really, because if you think about what happens in a young person's life, the things that happen in your early 20s set you on a course for the rest of your life. And why would you not want to maximize your chances and your opportunities when you're young? And I think makes perfect sense that you put a lot of effort into looking gorgeous, because that's social power. We tap into the power of society partly by how we appear to society, and I think that's the instinct that drives beautification in young women, is that it's maximizing their opportunity. So starting from that point, you can understand that some patients are basically, they're looking to look gorgeous. It's not a drive to remove problems or blemishes or harmonize things. It's about looking cutting edge, and you then need to decide whether you've got the skill to do that or whether you're afraid you're going to overreach. But that's a different conversation to whether there's something wrong with the patient for asking for more treatment. You've got to look at it from that perspective.
Mm-hmm. Why are we talking about this in the context of justifications? Is it because the aesthetic rules is one of the potential false gods?
So if it's your only justification for doing a treatment, I think will be insufficient in certain circumstances.
Aesthetic goals.
Yes. I mean, the extreme case would be, the Simon Weston example that I use, which is if you tried to normalize his face, you would actually be doing nothing medically justifiable because he accepts that. So, but there are many examples. I mean, that he's an extreme case, but even your granny who's pretty comfortable in her skin and isn't held back by it, that doing a procedure to make her look 5 years younger is medically not justifiable if she doesn't feel any different. That would be my argument. So you could be restoring her and the proportions could all be perfect, but if that's not the thing that's going to free her in her life, there's no point. It's the wrong God, effectively. And I think sometimes in consultations, I imagine it's quite common for clinicians to justify interventions based on an aesthetic ideal and do something to the patient that's risky that actually doesn't change how they feel in their skin. So, and this can actually be for under treatment as well. So I often think, even if you do a treatment that's really subtle and matches all the aesthetic goals, if that patient doesn't feel different and behave differently, that's also an unethical treatment. But if you believe that it's how the patient feels and behaves, that's ultimately your guiding light.
Because I think that in that case, you're slightly imposing your own view on that patient. For example, an example would be, I know that sometimes, for example, nurses are coming into this industry, they are, let's say a nurse who's in her 50s will come into this industry and maybe the 22-year-olds are coming up to her and saying, oh, what can I have? And the nurse is like, oh, you're gorgeous. Maybe you've got your own kids that age and you think, oh, you're gorgeous, you don't need anything. But that's the wrong, I understand it. I felt that way as well myself at the beginning of our career in aesthetics. But it's not right, is it? Because you aren't understanding them.
Yeah, that's a really and very common, and it comes from a good place as well.
Of course.
And but the desire to, I think actually women classically do it. You affirm each other. So you're gorgeous, babe. You don't need anything. How many times will you say that to your friend, even though your friend is still annoyed by the thing she doesn't like and she wants to get rid of it? But you don't want them to feel bad, so you give them that gift. And they think, well, you're a lovely person, but I still have my blemish. So that's a good example. You're imposing your value system on the person without looking at their life in context.
Yeah.
And I think it's really worth emphasizing that most of these come from a really good place, and it's not that the people are wrong for this, but I think that they are essentially you are putting something ahead of the internal experience of the person that you're treating, and it's not that is your only guiding light. You need to get everything in alignment, but you need to start with that.
And of course, it's in partnership, because they might say, well, I want 5 mils in my lips, that's going to make me happy. And they might not be dysmorphic, but you think to yourself, well, actually, that would, A, not be great for my brand, and B, actually...
Well, your brand's a false god. But yeah. it might...
No, that's fair enough.
It is, but it's not... That's the real reason is deeper than that you don't want to be associated with those treatments. It's because the further away you go from normal, the more uncertain you're going to be that the psychosocial impact's actually going to be good.
That's what I was going to say.
So you could have the classic situation is the person who's massively overtreated and loves it, but everyone is talking about how overtreated she is.
Instead of what she's saying.
Yeah. So this happened, that Molly May's the example. She was presumably happy until she got the response back from everyone saying, what have you done to your face? You're overtreated. And that's the social impact, and people ignore that. Like, treatments need to make someone feel good from the inside out, but they also need to enable them to respond to be received well in the environment that they go into. And it's a balancing act. It's difficult because even a bad haircut can put you in a disadvantage in social situations, but that's not something you do with the medical model. When it's aesthetic treatments and you're a medical person, you're trying to justify your treatment with the medical model, which is essentially, as I will keep banging on about, the psychosocial behavior and feeling of the patient in their situation.
So remind us about the hierarchy of justifications.
So my point of view is that the psychosocial health of the patient is number one. So you can't do any procedure without knowing how it's going to affect that. And then you can justify your interventions next, I believe, with the aesthetic. Like, what is the actual thing you're intending to change the appearance of? And how is that going to connect with the psychosocial impact of the patient? And then you need to justify it with an anatomical reason, because you need to understand the anatomy, because otherwise you can't do the injection, the actual procedure. And finally, it's the injection technique. So that's pretty much the reverse of how most plastic surgeons will speak about things, where they look for an anatomical justification. The anatomy's in there, but it's you have to line it up with all those other things. When you're actually doing the procedure, it's the other way around. You need to think about the anatomy just before the needle goes in, because you're trying to avoid complications. And then you have to think about the aesthetic, because you need to know when to stop injecting. And finally, you might worry about how your patient is responding to the actual feeling. But it's the reverse during the procedure. But in the consultation, it starts with the psychosocial and works through to the other gods that we need to know about.
So just give us a final practical tip about something that clinicians here watching this can ask their patients in the actual consultation that will start us to understand the psychosocial.
Ask them about a moment in the day that the thing that they are complaining about or wishing to change pops into their head and affects what they do. So if you can say it's the moment I put my makeup on, or it's on the school run, or it's when I'm taking a selfie, those are the classic ones, then you then have a moment that you can work to change. So, and you can make it part of the deal. So if I can do this procedure that achieves this aesthetic outcome, and that makes you feel a certain way, will you do the behavior that you're hoping to do? And you won't always get as far as behavior, because sometimes it's not conscious in their mind exactly what they're hoping to do differently. But I guarantee it's in there somewhere. There's a belief that if I feel differently, I will express myself differently and life will be better.
And then when they come back for the next treatment in 4 months' time, ask them about how it made them feel.
Yeah. And you will get the best stories out of this. You know, I've got so many, I collect them over the years. You know, someone who had an awful divorce and her tear troughs were holding her back, hadn't dated for ages. I won't give all the details. Eventually did meet someone, and fantastic, happened to be really rich. So she's on a yacht somewhere last time I saw her. But that was down to freeing her from that one piece of friction. And I only got to know that story and how important it was because I did that consultation. If you make it about the physical, or the anatomy, you miss out on the human side, and that's really what it's all about.
And then when you really understand their stories, you'll start to fall in love with aesthetics even more deeply, because you'll get the ultimate job satisfaction.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, guys, I hope that helped you understand how to orient yourself within the many decisions you have to make as a medical aesthetics practitioner, and hopefully improve your job satisfaction and help you realize that you really are changing lives when you do this well. And you'll collect stories of your own. In fact, if you've got any good stories and you can anonymize them, why don't you drop them in the comments below this YouTube video, and we would love to hear from you.
And let us know your biggest takeaway in the comments as well. We'd love to see those. And please do subscribe to the channel and hit the notifications so that you get notified whenever we upload.
Thanks for watching.
Take care.